Rukki, leib, Estonian sourdough rye bread. Leib refers to bread. It's the staff of daily life, but it's only rye bread. If it were white bread, it would be sai. If it were whole wheat, it would be sepik. But this is the traditional old farmhouse recipe, passed on through many generations. Here, myself in my great-grandmother's lap, and you can see it's already come to me through several generations. One's been visible yet behind us, and it is going forward also. Here my mother and myself with my son and my two grandchildren and her great-grandchildren, who are now becoming interested and wish to be making this bread with me as well. So they will carry the tradition. To make it simple, I've come to making it one loaf at a time rather than the big do as my mother preferred to do it. One loaf at a time is easy to knead, and you have it fresh for a couple of weeks, though it does keep well in the freezer. But then you also have the aroma of the bread in the house every few weeks. So it's a sourdough. A sourdough needs starter. You can get a starter perhaps from a friend. It's easy to pass it around. But if there is none handy nearby, what do you do? Well, you can make one. You can make one using probiotic yogurt. This is a yogurt that contains all the bacteria, the milk, lactobacillus, and similar bacteria that are also part of the rye starter. So if you add that probiotic yogurt to rye flour and warm water, put it in a warm place, it will start to sour. The bacteria, which are alive in the yogurt, start to live and be self-selected into the right ecosystem for the rye bread. Eventually, starter will also develop yeast, but the ones in the air here in the cities don't work, so we'll be adding yeast later. So this works for 1 to 3 days, depending on the temperature it's in. Not more than body temperature, because this is a live thing. It wants to keep being alive. When you have the starter, you will be keeping it in the fridge, always with a date on, because it can get quite confusing otherwise. And you take that starter, put it in a bowl, add 2 cups more rye flour and 2 cups more lukewarm water, just like making more starter essentially, and mix it. And this is what goes into souring in a warm place. I like to use my oven with the lights on, not the warming on, because the warming would be too hot. You want it not just warm. And then the starter will start living, using the new resources that it got with the new rye and the water, and it'll sour. It'll sour overnight and come out, in my case, quite bubbly because my yeast is somehow already crept in, but your first do with the new starter will be just sour. This is where you take out the new starter, because this is where you pass it on to the next generation of bread, the next loaf of bread. You put that in the fridge and it keeps up to a month. Then I set myself up for kneading. Although I'm not that short, I'm more short than I would like to be for this task, so I use a stool. That gives me a kind of a gravity advantage. Instead of pushing on my arms, I just lean over a bit, and it makes the kneading be very, very easy, very relaxing almost. And then I like to use a wooden board for this. You don't need it. You can just use the countertop. And before I start, I like to grease the pans. You can use butter or margarine. Both work well because both spread out and make a nice thick coat. You're only making one loaf, so only one pan. This is what the soured initial part looks like. It gets viscous. You can see how it's dripping from the spoon. This is the quality of rye that's unique. It's not at all like wheat flour with this kind of a slurry. It is at this stage I would add the yeast and a teaspoon of sugar to help the yeast grow quickly, kind of an extra jolt. Not too much. It would not work well. It has to use up the sugar. And if your starter already has yeast, you can go without it. But if you add it, it's kind of an assurance. You can be quite clear that that loaf is going to rise within a couple of hours when we get to that stage. So I also add half a cup of white flour, which in a way is cheating a bit. because it's the white flour has the gluten that makes it easier for the bread to rise. You can leave it out. It will work without, but it just feels like it makes a nicer texture. And it's just a little bit. It's less, it's only a few percent eventually when you work it out of how much flour there is there. And 1 cup of rye flour, and mix it. You can see that this mixture is starting to look quite thick and hard to mix. So here's what I do. I've added the flour, and mixing it in, you can see it's getting quite sticky. Sticky is the main thing I would call this, because right now I'm mixing it in with a wooden spoon, but eventually I'll be wanting to turn it out on the board for kneading. In fact, I don't even try and mix it too well. About a 1/4 cup of the rye flour on the board to cover it so it won't stick to the board, and the rest of the remaining further cup you're going to have. In other words, 3/4 cup standing on hand, ready to pull out when you need it. So what do you need it for? Well, for not sticking and for working in. All that extra cup of flour is going to get worked in eventually. And you might have to refer to the written recipe to get to remember how much this all was. Do you see how sticky it is? And to keep it from sticking to my fingers when I'm taking it off the spoon and trying to get out of the bowl, I just use a little of that extra flour to insulate me from the sticky mess. And that's what becomes useful for the whole kneading process that will carry on from here. You see, keeping a layer of flour on the board also makes it a layer of flour between the dough and my hands. So I'm just pushing down, folding it over, pushing down, folding, and you'll see bits come out of it. There's a piece that's been missed. Well, just grab it, stick it in, and it'll all get worked in. You keep doing this, as you see already, this is only a few seconds of kneading, it's become nice. I use a scraper to pick up the last little bits that you don't need to, but I'm frugal. And then just keep adding the flour, and little at a time, working it through. All of it eventually works its way in, one layer at a time, and by then it's also developed the gluten well. Here shows not quite done. It's still sticking to my hands. So a little bit more flour, a little bit more kneading, and here it's done. It takes an imprint, it doesn't stick, it makes a nice kind of springy dough. So that's going to be the loaf. You can shape it into a loaf, and roll it maybe a little, or you can just put it in the pan, punch it down, flatten it out, and that's ready to be going into the rice. Oh no, not quite. I also like to put on a layer of flour, the flour to keep it from drying out too much. It's funny how either a bit of flour or a bit of water will do that. I kind of like the aesthetics of the flour, and besides, I'm not getting my hands sticky again. So that goes into a warm place. I go back into the warming oven I had before. You set it there and let it rise until it has the shape of a finished loaf. This takes, with the added yeast, about 2 or 3 hours. And then, from there, it goes into the oven. Bake it at 350. The oven should be preheated for about 1 hour. When it's ready, it'll sound hollow, and you can then take it out of the oven and see what you've got, a finished loaf of rye bread. But what you've got even before that is a kitchen full of the most wonderful aroma of baking bread. So this particular loaf was special to me because I sent it still warm on the plane to England to my son and our grandchildren as my husband was going to visit. So there they were able to have a loaf of grandma's and our mom's fresh rye bread with butter on it, served to both the grandchildren and enjoyed together as a family. So this summer, the kids and I will be making it together as they come to visit me for the summer, and the tradition goes on. So, with gratitude to my past family, my present family, to all of them, inclusive of those that have joined us from other cultures. And I hope you enjoy the cross-cultural delights of doing the cultural delights. Thank you.